The Talking Donkey of Balaam, Numbers 22. The story of Balaam and his talking donkey is one of the most unusual accounts in the Hebrew Bible, yet its strangeness serves as a deliberate theological device. At first glance, it appears to be a fable-like tale about an animal miraculously speaking. However, when examined in its historical, cultural, and theological context, the episode reveals profound lessons about divine sovereignty, the danger of spiritual arrogance, and the blindness caused by greed. The account unfolds during a period of escalating tension. The Israelites, having wandered the wilderness for decades, had just defeated two powerful Amorite kings, Sihon and Og. These victories created fear in Moab, where King Balak ruled. Fearing destruction, Balak resorted to spiritual warfare. He summoned Balaam, a well-known prophet from Mesopotamia, whose reputation for blessing or cursing was so widely feared that kings believed outcomes of battles could turn on his words. In this opening context, Balaam is portrayed as more than a mere messenger of a deity. He is seen as a man of supernatural influence, whose services can be bought with wealth and honor. The narrative's irony centers on Balaam's role as a seer who cannot see. 3 times his donkey recognizes the angel of the Lord standing in their path with a drawn sword, and 3 times the animal reacts to save Balaam's life, swerving into a field, crushing Balaam's foot against a wall, and finally collapsing beneath him. Each time, Balaam responds with violence, striking the very creature preserving his life. The theological point is sharp. A supposed visionary prophet is spiritually blind, while a humble beast of burden sees clearly. This inversion critiques pride and demonstrates that true sight depends not on human status, but on God's revelation. Another central theme is the difference between God's directive will and permissive will. At first, God forbids Balaam from going with Balak's men, but when Balaam persists, enticed by the richer rewards of a second delegation, God allows him to go, while warning him to speak only what God commands. This illustrates the divine principle that God sometimes permits a person to follow a stubborn path while still holding them accountable for the heart behind their actions. Balaam's greed blinded him to God's intention, and his half-obedience brought him under judgment. The climax comes when God opens the donkey's mouth, allowing it to speak. It rebukes Balaam with reasoned questions about his cruelty, pointing out its lifelong loyalty. Remarkably, Balaam shows no shock at the animal's speech but argues back, further underscoring his dulled perception. In the ancient Near East, talking animals or omens were not inconceivable, but the issue here is Balaam's failure to heed the warning. Only when God opens his eyes does Balaam see the angel and realize he was moments from death. The angel identifies himself as an adversary, or Satan, meaning an opponent sent by God to obstruct Balaam's reckless path. The drawn sword that Balaam had wished to use on the donkey now threatens his own life, reversing the threat he projected. This vivid irony conveys the lesson that unchecked anger and moral compromise place a person under the very judgment they wish to inflict on others. This episode is not a whimsical story, but a theological comedy meant to dismantle arrogance and self-deception. The talking donkey represents God's ability to use the lowest means to expose spiritual blindness, while Israel itself remains entirely unaware of the supernatural threat aimed against it. Behind the strangeness is a profound reminder that God's providence often works unseen, overturning human folly to preserve his people. Ezekiel's vision of the throne chariot, Ezekiel 1. Ezekiel's opening vision is among the most elaborate and terrifying passages in biblical literature. Its imagery is so complex that it has inspired centuries of commentary, ranging from mystical traditions to modern symbolic interpretation. To those who first received it, the strangeness was not arbitrary, but carefully constructed to communicate urgent truths about God's sovereignty and presence during a national crisis. The vision occurs in the year 593 before Christ, when Ezekiel, a priest, is among the first group of Judean exiles living by the Chebar Canal in Babylon. The temple in Jerusalem, once considered the dwelling place of God's glory, is on the verge of destruction. For the Israelites, this represented theological catastrophe. In their worldview, the God of Israel seemed defeated by Babylon's gods, especially Marduk. Into this despair, Ezekiel receives a vision that overturns their assumptions and redefines how God's presence should be understood. The vision begins with a storm wind from the north, a great cloud flashing with fire. Such imagery recalls earlier manifestations of God's glory at Mount Sinai and the Wilderness Tabernacle, signaling continuity with Israel's founding encounters. The location is itself a radical message. God's glory appears not in Jerusalem but in a foreign land, asserting that his sovereignty extends beyond geography. The strange details that follow build upon this central declaration of mobility and universality. Ezekiel first describes 4 living creatures, later identified as cherubim, who serve as guardians of divine holiness. Each has 4 faces: human, lion, ox, and eagle. These faces symbolize the noblest aspects of all creation: humanity representing wisdom, the lion strength, the ox service and endurance, and the eagle's swiftness and dominion over the skies. Ancient Near Eastern art was filled with hybrid beings such as the Assyrian Lamassu, but unlike those, which were themselves deities, these composite beings exist only as servants bearing the throne of the true God. This underlines the point that all created order, even its most majestic forms, functions in submission to him. Beside each creature is a wheel, described as a wheel within a wheel. This unique design allows for motion in any direction without turning. The imagery is deliberate. God's purposes move with unstoppable directness and do not need to adjust course. The rims of these wheels are full of eyes, a symbol of total knowledge. Nothing is hidden from God's awareness. His governance extends to every corner of creation. Above the creatures is an expanse of crystal-like firmament, and above that a throne of sapphire. On this throne sits the likeness of a man, radiating fire and encircled by a rainbow. This detail is crucial. God is not depicted as a monstrous machine, but as a personal, relational being whose overwhelming majesty is still balanced by covenant mercy, represented in the rainbow's reminder of his promise to Noah. The fire conveys consuming holiness and judgment, while the anthropomorphic form affirms his personal nature. The cumulative message of this bizarre throne chariot is that God is not confined to the ruins of Jerusalem nor defeated by pagan powers. He is radically mobile, infinitely sovereign, and actively present with his people in exile. The elaborate complexity reinforces his overwhelming transcendence, restoring to the exiles a vision of God's unmatched majesty. For a people who felt abandoned and defeated, this vision re-established hope by proclaiming that the Lord of Israel was, in fact, the Lord of all creation, ruling from a throne that moves wherever his people are found. Zipporah and the bridegroom of blood. Exodus 4. Between Moses' commissioning at the burning bush and his return to confront Pharaoh lies one of the most cryptic passages in the Torah. It describes a life-threatening encounter at a lodging place where the Lord met him and sought to kill him. The brevity and ambiguity of the text has generated centuries of debate, but beneath the obscurity lies a sharp theological statement about covenantal faithfulness and the cost of leadership. The account opens with Moses, his Midianite wife Zipporah, and their son traveling toward Egypt. Suddenly, God's anger erupts in a direct confrontation that nearly ends Moses' life, or possibly his son's life. The Hebrew pronouns are imprecise, leaving it unclear whether the attack targeted Moses or Gershom. Regardless, the event is not an idle threat. The phrase "sought to kill" reflects a moment of real judgment, perhaps manifesting as a sudden and severe illness. The immediacy of the danger forces resolution. The cause of this deadly encounter is widely recognized. Moses' son was uncircumcised. Circumcision was the physical sign of God's covenant with Abraham, instituted in Genesis chapter 17 with an explicit warning that any uncircumcised male would be cut off from the covenant community. For the man who was to become Israel's deliverer and lawgiver, failure to uphold this foundational command in his own household represented hypocrisy and disqualification. Moses could not confront Pharaoh about God's firstborn son Israel, while neglecting the covenantal mark of his own son. In this crisis, it is Zipporah who acts decisively. She seizes a flint knife, an archaic instrument that highlights the ancient origins of the rite, and circumcises her son. She then touches the bloody foreskin to Moses' feet, a common biblical euphemism for the male genitals. This act can be understood as applying the covenant sign to Moses himself, symbolically transferring responsibility back onto him. The result is immediate. God's wrath subsides, and the family's mission can proceed. Zipporah then utters the enigmatic phrase, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." Interpretations vary. Some see it as a cry of resentment at the violent rite forced upon her family. Others read it as an acknowledgement that through blood she has effectively won her husband back from death, as though remarrying him under dire circumstances. Samaritan tradition even preserves a variant where Zipporah cuts herself rather than her son, though this remains a minority view. Regardless of the exact meaning, the statement captures the gravity and shock of the moment. Theologically, this unsettling episode functions as a crucible for Moses. Before he can challenge Pharaoh as God's emissary, he must align his own household with the covenant. Leadership in God's plan requires personal fidelity. The life-threatening nature of the confrontation underscores the seriousness with which God regards covenant obedience. It is not optional or symbolic only. It is the very condition of life and mission. Thus, what seems like a bizarre interruption in the narrative serves a precise purpose. It strips away any illusion that Moses can lead on charisma or calling alone. His authority must be grounded in uncompromising obedience. Through Zipporah's swift and bloody act, the deliverer is delivered, and the mission to liberate Israel proceeds with renewed gravity. The fate of Lot's wife. Genesis 19. The story of Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt is one of the briefest yet most haunting moments in Genesis. The account takes place during the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, when God rains down fire and brimstone upon the cities for their corruption. Lot, his wife, and their daughters are granted deliverance by angelic messengers, but the command accompanying their escape is clear: flee for your lives, do not look back, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Against this explicit warning, Lot's wife looks back, and the text tersely records her transformation into a pillar of salt. Though strange, this punishment is far from arbitrary. It is laden with symbolic and geographical meaning. The act of looking back is not merely curiosity. Within biblical theology, it represents a divided heart. While her body moved toward safety, her affections remained tethered to Sodom. To look back in this context was to express attachment to a condemned world, a refusal to fully abandon the life being destroyed. In this sense, Lot's wife embodies the danger of incomplete repentance. Her heart clung to the past, even as her feet moved toward deliverance. Jesus himself later references her fate with the stark command, "Remember Lot's wife," using her as a warning against divided loyalty in times of judgment. The transformation into salt functions as a perfect metaphor for this spiritual failure. By lingering in longing for a corrupt city, she becomes literally frozen in place, unable to move forward. The salt pillar embodies paralysis, a life halted midway between salvation and destruction. Her form becomes a monument to the consequences of looking backward instead of embracing the future God provides. Geography deepens the symbolism. The region around the Dead Sea, where this judgment occurs, is the lowest point on Earth and one of the most desolate landscapes known. Its extreme salinity prevents life, and erosion has carved eerie formations out of its salt-rich mountains. Prominent among these is Mount Sodom, composed largely of rock salt. For centuries, travelers have pointed to a particular pillar of salt on its slopes as Lot's wife. Geological studies suggest that such pillars could indeed have formed through cave collapses or seismic activity thousands of years ago, aligning intriguingly with the general time period of the biblical events. Whether or not one specific formation is the pillar in question, the story clearly arose within a setting where the land itself bore natural reminders of barrenness and judgment. Thus, the punishment corresponds exactly to the environment. Lot's wife is not arbitrarily struck down but is transformed into part of the lifeless landscape her heart refused to leave. She becomes a monument of desolation within a land already marked as cursed. The strange detail of salt, rather than stone or ash, underscores the completeness of the judgment. She is fused with the very terrain that symbolizes sterility and death. The brief but powerful story illustrates how salvation requires not only physical departure from destruction, but wholehearted detachment from the life being judged. Lot's wife failed to make this inner separation, and her fate became both geological explanation and theological warning. Her petrified form, preserved in memory if not in stone, embodies the consequence of divided devotion. Jesus writing on the ground, John 8. The scene in which Jesus stoops to write on the ground during the confrontation with the woman caught in adultery is striking for its silence and ambiguity. No explanation is given in the text about what he wrote, and this omission has led to centuries of speculation, yet the action itself, embedded in its historical and theological context, carries layers of meaning that reach far beyond curiosity. First, it is important to note the textual background of the story, often referred to as the Pericope Adulterae. The account is absent from the earliest and most reliable manuscripts of John's Gospel, and only appears consistently in copies produced centuries later. Some manuscripts even place the passage in Luke's Gospel instead. Most scholars conclude it was not part of the original text, but an authentic oral tradition about Jesus that was later added. Its survival reflects how deeply early Christians valued the episode as a true expression of his character. The narrative itself describes a trap. Religious leaders present a woman accused of adultery and cite the Mosaic Law, which prescribes stoning. They demand a judgment from Jesus, hoping to place him in a no-win situation. If he condones stoning, he contradicts his reputation for mercy and possibly violates Roman law, which reserved execution powers for the imperial authorities. If he refuses, he can be accused of rejecting the law of Moses. His enemies intend to discredit him publicly either way. Instead of responding immediately, Jesus stoops and writes on the ground. The act interrupts the pressure of the moment, forcing his accusers to wait. The text does not reveal his words, but several theories have been advanced. Some interpreters connect the act to Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 13, which speaks of those who forsake God being written in the dust. Others suggest he may have been writing out portions of the law, perhaps highlighting the command that both the adulterous man and woman must be punished, exposing the leader's selective enforcement. Another possibility is that he wrote the sins of the accusers themselves, confronting them with private conviction. Roman legal practice also provides context. Judges sometimes wrote sentences before announcing them, so Jesus may have been symbolically assuming judicial authority before speaking his verdict. Regardless of the precise content, the act of writing achieves a deliberate effect. By bending down, Jesus lowers himself physically, refusing to stand in a position of judgment over the woman. His silence destabilizes the mob and redirects attention away from her sin toward their own hearts. When he finally speaks, his words crystallize the point. "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." The combination of his writing and his statement turns the trap back upon the accusers, exposing their hypocrisy. One by one they leave, convicted not by shouted argument but by the quiet weight of conscience. This is the only recorded instance of Jesus writing, which adds further significance. In biblical tradition, the only other explicit reference to divine writing is God inscribing the Ten Commandments with his own finger. By writing in the dust, Jesus symbolically aligns himself with the divine lawgiver, not to condemn, but to reinterpret the law in light of mercy and truth. His action reveals him as the one with true authority to judge, yet also as the one who chooses mercy over death. What appears to be a mysterious gesture is in fact a profound nonverbal proclamation. Jesus resists a false dilemma, reasserts divine authority, and provides a model of justice tempered by grace, all through the simple yet unsettling act of writing in the dust. Elisha and the Bears of Bethel, 2 Kings 2. The account of Elisha calling down a curse on a group of youths, followed by 2 she-bears mauling 42 of them, is one of the most troubling episodes in the Old Testament. At first reading, it appears to describe a prophet overreacting to a childish insult with disproportionate violence. However, when examined in its historical, cultural, and theological context, the story reveals itself as a deliberate narrative about the defense of prophetic authority in hostile territory. The background is crucial. Elisha has just inherited the prophetic office from Elijah, whose fiery departure in a whirlwind established the seriousness of his legacy. Now Elisha is approaching Bethel, a major center of idolatrous calf worship established by King Jeroboam as a rival to the Jerusalem temple. In this environment, hostility to Yahweh's prophets was not incidental but institutional. What unfolds is therefore less a random encounter than a calculated confrontation in enemy territory. The crowd that meets Elisha is described in Hebrew as Ne'arim. The King James Version famously translated this as little children, but the term actually refers to a broad range of ages, from adolescents to young men capable of military action. Joseph is called a Na'ar at age 17, and Isaac is also described with the same word as a young adult. The size of the group, at least 42 individuals, suggests an organized, potentially dangerous mob rather than a few mischievous children. Their insult is equally weighty. They chant, "Go up, you bald head." On the surface, this may sound like mockery of Elisha's appearance, but in context, it carries layered meaning. The phrase "go up" uses the same verb employed just verses earlier to describe Elijah's ascension into heaven. In effect, they are taunting Elisha to disappear like his master, mocking both the miraculous departure and Elisha's legitimacy as successor. Calling him baldhead adds further contempt. In the ancient Near East, baldness often symbolized weakness, disease, or shame, while Elijah had been remembered as a hairy man. The insult therefore declared Elisha to be illegitimate, powerless, and unworthy to carry Elijah's mantle. Elisha's response, cursing them, "In the name of the Lord," must be understood as an official prophetic act rather than a personal outburst. In biblical tradition, invoking God's name formalized the action as divinely sanctioned. The sudden emergence of two she-bears, which mauled 42 of the youths, is presented as a sign of divine judgment rather than random chance. Importantly, judgment through wild beasts is listed in Leviticus as one of the covenant curses that would fall upon those who rejected God. The attack therefore signals not just personal vindication for Elisha, but the enactment of covenantal consequences against apostasy and rebellion. Seen in this light, the event takes on strategic importance. Elisha's prophetic authority was at its most vulnerable, newly established, and under public challenge. If he had ignored the taunts or retreated, his legitimacy would have been undermined at the outset, weakening the prophetic voice in Israel's northern kingdom. The shocking judgment serves as a dramatic confirmation that God's power rests upon him just as it had upon Elijah. While the story still disturbs modern readers, its meaning lies in its context. It was a confrontation over spiritual authority and loyalty to God in a place aligned with idolatry. The bears become instruments of divine justice, a terrifying sign that to reject God's prophet was to invite covenantal judgment. The folded linens in the empty tomb, John 20. In the resurrection account of the Gospel of John, a small detail is recorded that has fascinated generations of readers: the state of the burial cloths in Jesus' empty tomb. The description notes that the long linen strips were lying in one place, while the face cloth was folded separately. On the surface, this might appear to be an incidental observation. However, in its historical and theological context, the detail serves as a subtle but powerful indicator of the reality of the resurrection. Over time, a popular interpretation emerged, often preached as a sermon illustration, claiming that the folded cloth carried a secret message. According to this story, ancient Jewish dining custom dictated that if a master left the table with his napkin crumpled, it signaled he was finished, but if he folded it, it meant he would return. Applied to the tomb, the folded cloth would symbolize Jesus' promise to come back. This explanation is appealing, but historical investigation reveals no evidence for such a custom in Jewish or Greco-Roman sources. The story appears to be a modern invention, probably arising within the last few decades. The Greek text itself clarifies the issue. The word translated napkin in older versions like the King James Bible is sudarion, a loan word from Latin sudarium, meaning sweat cloth. It referred to a cloth used to wipe perspiration or, in funerary practice, placed over the face of the deceased. It had nothing to do with dining practices. Thus, the folded face cloth in the tomb must be understood in terms of burial customs, not table etiquette. The theological weight of the detail lies in its forensic character. In the ancient world, grave robbery was a real concern, and John's Gospel explicitly frames the initial fear of the disciples around the possibility of theft. But the arrangement of the cloth argues against such an explanation. If friends had stolen the body to fabricate a resurrection, they would have acted quickly and fearfully, taking the body still wrapped or leaving the wrappings in chaos. If enemies had removed the body to quash resurrection claims, they would likewise have left disorder, not careful arrangement. The folded face cloth conveys deliberateness and calm, suggesting an orderly departure rather than a hurried removal. The scene is further reinforced by the presence of the linen strips, which were used to wrap the body tightly with spices, Their placement indicates that the body was not unwrapped in the usual way but had passed through them, leaving them behind. This quiet evidence confronts Peter and the beloved disciple with a reality that cannot be explained by theft or desecration. John notes that upon seeing this arrangement, he saw and believed, even before encountering the risen Lord. The folded cloth thus serves as a subtle signature of resurrection. It indicates that Jesus' departure from the tomb was neither rushed nor forced, but carried out with sovereign control. Instead of being a message about dining customs, it is forensic testimony embedded in narrative detail, reassuring readers that what occurred was not a human scheme but a divine act. The strangeness of such a small observation carries great weight, transforming the empty tomb from a mystery into evidence of the new creation inaugurated by Christ's resurrection. The healing of the blind man with mud, John 9. The story of Jesus healing a man born blind is unusual not only because of the miracle itself but because of the strange method he uses. Rather than speaking a word of healing, Jesus spits on the ground, mixes mud with his saliva, applies it to the man's eyes, and then commands him to wash in the pool of Siloam. The oddity of this act has puzzled readers for centuries, but when examined carefully, it reveals layers of theological symbolism. First, the condition of the man is emphasized. He was blind from birth, a situation considered incurable in the ancient world. The disciples interpret his affliction through a common cultural lens, asking whether the blindness was the result of his own sin or his parents' sin. Jesus corrects them, stating that the condition exists so that the works of God might be displayed. This reframes suffering not as punishment but as an arena where divine power can be revealed. The method Jesus employs evokes the creation account in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 2, God formed man from the dust of the ground. By mixing dust with his own spittle and placing it on the man's eyes, Jesus enacts a symbolic act of recreation. He is not simply repairing damaged tissue, he is performing a creative work that recalls humanity's original formation. In this way, the miracle serves as a declaration of his divine identity, as the one who has the power of the Creator himself. The timing of the miracle further heightens its meaning. John notes that it occurred on the Sabbath. According to the oral traditions of the Pharisees, kneading substances together was prohibited work on that day. By intentionally mixing mud, Jesus not only heals, but also provokes a direct confrontation with the rigid legalism of the religious authorities. His act asserts that the Sabbath is not about prohibiting acts of mercy, but about fulfilling God's intention for rest and restoration. By using a method that challenged their definitions of work, Jesus demonstrates that he is Lord of the Sabbath, and that his authority surpasses theirs. The command to wash in the pool of Siloam adds a further layer. The pool's name means sent, and John explicitly interprets this as significant, pointing to Jesus as the one sent from the Father. The man's journey to the pool, still blind with mud caked on his eyes, becomes a test of faith. Only by obeying the instruction does he receive sight. This sequence transforms the miracle into a living parable of salvation. Humanity, blinded from birth, is touched by the incarnate Word, responds in obedience, and receives new life through the one sent by God. The aftermath of the miracle reinforces the theme. The man not only gains physical sight, but gradually comes to recognize Jesus' true identity. His testimony evolves from identifying Jesus as the man called Jesus to a prophet and finally to confessing him as Lord. The strange process of mud and washing thus frames a journey from darkness to light, both physically and spiritually. What seems at first like an odd, almost primitive healing method is therefore saturated with meaning. The use of dust and saliva recalls creation, the timing on the Sabbath confronts legalism, and the command to wash embodies the call to faith. The miracle demonstrates that Jesus is not simply a healer but the divine creator who brings light into the world, restoring both sight and spiritual understanding.